Hi everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to the Golden Visa Investment Options in Portugal webinar. Today's webinar will explore investment opportunities in Portugal. And here to share their perspective on this, we have Bilton, who is the chairman and founder of the Sovereign Group, one of the world's largest privately owned consultancies specializing in the provision of offshore trusts and companies associated with international tax advice. We'll hear from Howard, and then we'll also have time at the end for questions, which can be asked via the chat box on Zoom. So over to you, Howard.
Thank you very much, Martinez. Yes, welcome everybody, and thanks for having me electronically. By all means, ask questions throughout by putting them in the chat room, and I'll take them as and when they arise if I think it's appropriate. Otherwise, I'll leave them to the end, but I'll try and answer any and all questions. So first, just to expand a bit on the kind introduction Martina made. Yes, I started Sovereign Group in Gibraltar in 1987 and lived there for 5 years, well, living in Spain and working in Gibraltar, and then moved to Hong Kong in 1992. So I'm shortly going to have been here 30 years. While in Gibraltar, I started an office for Sovereign in Portugal. We actually do a lot of tax work down in the Algarve, where our office is, and I've known Portugal very well for 35 years. More recently, I've been going a lot to Portugal because I made the very unwise decision to start making wine, and that is going to ensure that I will be continuing to work much longer than otherwise, as that is the truism is, yes, if you've got more money than sense, start a winery, and then you'll soon end up with more sense than money. So that's really what's been happening. But anyway, I've known Portugal very well for a long time, and the Golden Visa opportunity has been around for 2 or 3 years now and has been hugely successful for the Portuguese. Now, I will talk a little bit about the Golden Visa, but I'm also going to talk about the non-habitual residency, as I believe most of you are British or hold British passports. And if that is the case, then the Golden Visa opportunity will be of less interest to you because you don't need it. So I'll tell you how that works and then tell you why it may not be applicable to you. So the Golden Visa is immigration by investment. If you invest €500,000 in prime property in Lisbon, Porto, and the Algarve, they will give you a permanent residency. That's it in simple terms. So you buy your way into the country. You'll be aware that really every country in the world operates similar schemes. You can go through the normal immigration channels and take your time and take your chance, or you can buy your way in on an expedited program. So all countries do it, and it's the price and the time scale which varies. Some indeed will give you an immediate passport in return for investment. I've seen a lot of comments that Portugal will give you nationality in return for investment. It won't. It will give you residency, which can lead to nationality in 6 years after successful application. Now, if you're a Brit, you don't need this because you can obtain residency in Portugal as of right now, because until the end of this year, Brits are still considered as being part of the EU for these purposes. After the end of this year, that will no longer be the case. So then if you want to go and live in Portugal, you would have to apply under the normal immigration rules. And at that stage, the Golden Visa may well be an attractive option for you rather than going through the usual immigration channels. And there are many ways that you can obtain residency in Portugal. Now, the Golden Visa and the NHR status are quite often mentioned in the same breath or in the same they'll be of interest. Anybody who goes through the Golden Visa should also be interested in the non-habitual residency. The non-habitual residency is a misnomer. It's a typical Portuguese thing. In order to get a non-habitual residency, you actually have to be an habitual resident. But the beauty of it is that it can confer a tax status on you, which would allow you to live there tax-free for 10 years. It's not just a straightforward exemption. Some planning is necessary, but essentially it was until very recently tax-free for 10 years. They've just altered the rules slightly so that now pension income is taxed at 10%, but other worldwide income, if properly planned, is not taxed at all. So for most people on this call, on this webinar, I suspect it would be relatively easy to arrange your affairs so that there is, you are coming under, you have a 10-year tax holiday. And certainly we can help with that. I suspect if you've got pension income, then there is something you can do about that. You can roll it up or not have it paid out, or convert it in certain circumstances, but essentially that would be subject to 10% tax. The rest of your worldwide income would not, if correctly planned. That is, except for any income earned locally in Portugal, but I'm fairly sure most of you will not have any of that currently, and probably wouldn't if you chose to move. Now, the urgency in the matter is just that if you're a British passport holder, you only get until the end of the year to apply for this status without going through a much more expensive and elongated immigration procedure. So right now, you can get NHR status very easily and very simply. You have to turn up at the local town hall, local to wherever you're going to live in Portugal, with your passport, register yourself and go through another formalities. And generally speaking, we have somebody on the ground who will hold your hand and take you through that. So the whole process you need to allow 4 or 5 days for, where you go to different departments to register for tax, open a bank account, register with the town hall. The starting point is you must have an address in Portugal. This does not mean that you have to purchase property. You don't. You can just rent a flat, or you can rent a room in a friend's house if you know anybody else who owns their own property there. You can actually rent a room in somebody's house if they rent their property, provided their lease doesn't prevent them from subletting. The Portuguese tend to check on these things, and although strictly speaking, if you're in breach of the lease, that's a matter between the tenant and the landlord. They say, well, you can't sublet, so this cannot be your address. Well, of course it can. It just means your friend is breaching the lease. But all you need is an address. And you don't even have to pay rent for your address. You can just offer to contribute to the general overheads of the house or the expenses. So if you paid rent there, he would need to pay tax on the rent. Presumably, he'd want you to cover that somehow. So it's a very simple and straightforward process to provide this address that you need. And that's really all you need to do. Get your address, turn up there for 3 or 4 days, get yourself registered, which we will hold your hand for, and you can then be officially a Portuguese resident. And you will be a full resident. So in theory, you would be then tax resident as well and subject to tax on your worldwide income. So that's when your NHR status comes in. That is a different procedure added to your residency application, which gives you this tax-free status. So armed with that, you are then legally able to go and live in Portugal anytime you wish. It doesn't mean you have to go and live in Portugal. In theory, your NHR status could lapse, but that doesn't really matter because you are still legally resident. And if you're not actually spending enough time to maintain your NHR status, then you're not tax resident. You're just legally resident, so you wouldn't have a tax bill anyway. So one way or another, you will not pay tax in Portugal as long as you apply for this status. And as I say, the urgency is just that is available to British passport holders only until the end of the year. Very straightforward. Now, I suspect if you're dialing onto this seminar, you're probably pretty familiar with Portugal, so you know about its attractions as a place. But for me, Lisbon's the coolest city on the planet, and I think that's an opinion shared by many. It's still relatively cheap to live there. Property prices, particularly in this €500,000 bracket, have gone up substantially in the previous years. And what has tended to happen is that anybody building a development where the flats would have cost 350,000 euros or something like that. They've put the price up to €500,000 so they can qualify under this golden visa scheme. So there's been pressure on the property market all the way up the band until you get perhaps above 750, when that is of no longer interesting to the golden visa applicants. So those have gone up in line with the market, but not above that. So it's relatively cheap to buy property there. It's relatively cheap to live there. Your household bills, food, everything is relatively cheap. You've got one of the nicest climates in Europe. Lisbon says there are 300 days of sunshine a year, which makes it the sunniest capital city in Europe. Not the sunniest city, but the sunniest capital. You're 20 minutes from the beaches of Cascais and Estoril and up that coast. You are 20 minutes away from the wine country in the Alentejo, where I make my wine, and as do many others. There is nothing really not to like. And then when you put that together with the ability to live there tax-free for 10 years, and you've got a pretty compelling package. And that's how it works. Now, with the golden visa, there are also some changes coming to that. As of the end of the year, we are fairly sure that a qualifying investment for these purposes will not include property in any coastal area or a Porto, Lisbon and the Algarve. So they're trying to force the investment further inland to more deprived areas, and if you buy property there, you will still qualify. And in some of those areas, actually the price, the entry price is as low as 350,000. If you go into what's termed a development area, then you need only spend 350,000. So that option will still be available. So for those without an EU passport, that is the cheapest and easiest way in. There are other investments you can make other than property. You can put money into a qualifying fund. You can start a business there which employs 10 people. There are a lot of different options, but the property investment route is by far the simplest and essentially the cheapest, as certainly the estate agents and property developers in Portugal throughout would argue that their property is only going up and going up quite rapidly. And certainly over the last couple of years, that has been true. So it's a good investment, as well as carrying this right to go and live there. So that can be very attractive if you're not an EU resident. Otherwise, you don't need it. EU residents have the right to live there without going through further immigration formality. However, once you've got your golden visa, that doesn't confer the tax-free status. That is, again, a separate item. So you need to combine it with your non-habitual residency, your NHR status, if you are going to go and live there. Now, what tends to be happening is those who are applying for the golden visa largely don't really want to live there. They just want the travel privilege, because Portugal is EU and it's also part of the Schengen area. So armed with your Portuguese residency, you get automatic travel rights anywhere within the EU, with the exception of Britain, which isn't party to Schengen, but you can travel freely within the EU. So that's a big attraction for a lot of people. You can also, after it's 6 years in effect, 5 years of permanent residency, apply for Portuguese nationality. Now, the emphasis on is that you can apply. No matter what anybody tells you, that status is not guaranteed to be granted. Now, at the moment, there is a peculiarity in the laws of Portugal, in that under every other immigration status, you could apply after 6 years, but unless you could show that you had lived there for pretty well full time throughout that period, your application is going to get turned down. They will not give it. Now, we spent some time investigating the legal status of the golden visa applicants and eventually got through to the equivalent of the Home Office in Portugal, who confirmed that the current practice is not to require golden visa applicants to live in Portugal to get nationality. So at the moment, you take out that status and 6 years later, they will give you a passport without you living there. You do have to pass a couple of tests, and principal among those is you need to be able to speak Portuguese, but I'm informed the standard required is pretty bad, or it's not difficult. So rudimentary knowledge of the language would be required. Very little else in terms of successful applicants. So at the moment, that is the case. Now, personally, I feel that the EU will probably force Portugal to change that. As you will know, if you get Portuguese nationality or indeed residency, you can live as of right anywhere else in the EU. And their requirements for granting you nationality are very different, and mostly you do have to go and live there. So they're not very enamored with the idea that where their requirement says you must live here for 5 years, Portugal's requirements say you don't have to, but once armed with your Portuguese passport, you can go and live in any other EU country as of right. So you can see there is a dichotomy there, and they don't like it. Similarly, the EU have been complaining that this special tax status is attracting residents and unfairly competing with them on tax. Well, all EU countries have different tax rates. They are trying to harmonise them as far as possible. That hasn't happened. I don't think it's a particularly good argument, but in response to that, there is a rumour, well, more than a rumour, we think this is fairly certain to come in, we're just not sure when, that the zero tax status will change to a 10% tax status. And we thought that was coming in fairly quickly, perhaps as early as the last budget, which took place last month. It didn't, but it's still on the cards. So again, if you've got any intention of wanting to go and live in Portugal, it would pay to try and whack in your application as fast as possible, because we are informed that any changes to the tax status would not be retrospective. So if they've given you a 10-year tax-free deal, you keep that 10-year tax-free deal, even if for any new applicants, the deal changes and they charge you 10%. So another reason to do this quickly. I was actually going to be down there last month doing my own, but obviously the coronavirus has stopped any travel in and out and the ability to do that, but I shall be down there as fast as possible as soon as we open up to get my own NHR status, because I'm fairly sure at some stage I will want to go and live there. And I want to make sure that I can do that as cheaply as possible. I think that's actually the basics that you need to know. To say there's been confusion about these two different stati, if that's the plural of status, and that NHR and Golden Visa are the same thing. They're not. There's also been confusion that if you have a golden visa, you automatically get NHR status. You do not. So they're two very separate things, but they can be combined to very good effect. I think that fills you in largely with what I think you should know about this, and hopefully instills in you some sense of urgency if you are interested in it. But I'm very happy to take questions. And we have some on the chat. Sorry, I haven't been paying attention to those. I won't give names out, as I'm not sure whether everybody wants to be anonymous. I have a question here. I hold a US and an Australian passport, so don't have the UK advantage. That is correct, you don't. So you would have to, if you wish to go and live in Portugal, apply through the normal immigration channels, and your golden visa then becomes very applicable to you. And again, as with the NHR, if you wish to take the easy and most popular route of buying prime Lisbon, Oporto or Algarve property, and Lisbon's the place in my view, then you only have until the end of the year to do that, after which that investment will no longer qualify you for your golden visa. So there is some, again, urgency to do that if that is the way you're thinking. If you would be wishing to apply and are happy to go to a more remote location in the country, then an investment of €500,000 or even as low as 350,000 would still qualify you for the golden visa. So that would still be an option, as indeed with all the other investment options. But I would say about 99% of the people going through the golden visa have done it by buying Lisbon property, and that's coming to an end. I think that's definitive. It may just need to make the final passage through the legal process in Portugal, but it's pretty well certain that that is going to happen, and it's pretty well certain that that will happen. The legislation will be passed now, but you will have till the end of the year to make the investment. I hope that answers that question. The same person has asked me, how many days does one need to spend there per year to maintain NHR status? Yes, this is a rather peculiar one. Officially, to maintain NHR status, Portugal has to be your main home, and that's really a matter of fact. However, there is really no consequence of not maintaining NHR status, and again, this is so Portuguese. If you don't have NHR status, it's because you aren't resident in Portugal, and if you're not resident in Portugal for tax purposes, so let's distinguish between legal residency, which is your legal ability to live there, and tax residency, which is your liability to tax. So if you're not doing enough days to be an NHR, then you're not doing enough days to get any sort of tax bill in Portugal at all. So either way, you're tax-free. And if you cease qualifying for NHR status, they don't take the status away. It's just you've used up a year of this 10-year needlessly. So the advice up until this point was wait until you actually need it, because you don't want to have the 10-year clock ticking needlessly. That advice has now changed, or my advice on the subject has, purely for the fact that if you wait too long, it'll no longer be a 10-year tax-free holiday, it'll be a 10-year 10% tax deal. And also, which doesn't apply to you, sir, you would have to go through the golden visa or another immigration channel to achieve the NHR status, but for Brits, they wouldn't. So it's such a Portuguese way of looking at things, where the title is the exact opposite of what they actually mean. And there is this peculiarity that it's really meaningless if you don't spend enough time there. Your tax bill is the same and your status is maintained. So as soon as you do spend enough time there, then you're tax resident, but you're tax-free because of the NHR status. I hope that answers the question. Another question, do we have to pay tax for overseas income if we retire in Portugal? Not if you have NHR status. You would not pay tax on your overseas income in Portugal. That doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't pay tax anywhere outside Portugal. I think there is a common misconception that if you are tax resident in Portugal, or indeed Hong Kong, or indeed anywhere in the world, that that's the end of the matter. But it is actually perfectly possible for you to be tax resident and liable to tax on your worldwide income in many different countries at the same time. So I could easily arrange your affairs for anybody on this call if they wished, and I'm not expecting a big uptake on this offer, so that you were legally tax resident in the UK, in Portugal, in Hong Kong, and in another country all at the same time. And then in theory and in practice, you are liable to tax on the same income in all those different places at their normal rates. So you could reach the situation where your tax bill is actually greater than the income you're being charged to tax. It's very easy to do that either by mistake. Nobody does it on purpose. Luckily, we have tax treaties which would normally decide who gets the taxing right, or give you a credit against tax paid in one country on the same income which is taxable in another. So typically in Hong Kong, we have a pretty lenient tax system, obviously, which only taxes Hong Kong source income. But if you were tax resident in Portugal and you were tax resident in Hong Kong, which is perfectly possible, because if you spend more than 90 days a year in Hong Kong, you can be tax resident here. So you could produce Hong Kong source income, be taxable in Hong Kong, but because you're tax resident in Portugal, where you need to spend a much smaller amount of time, and you become tax resident in Portugal if you spend 180 days in any one year, or it is your main home. So if you spent more time in Portugal than you did in Hong Kong, say 100 days, and you had a house there available for your use, you would probably be considered Portuguese tax resident. So now you're tax resident in both places. So income earned in Hong Kong and subject to Hong Kong tax is also taxable in Portugal. So you're taxable on both. Now, the tax treaty might serve to sort that out and decide who gets the taxing right, or they would probably give you a credit against tax paid in Portugal against tax due in Portugal. But if we do this planning correctly, you could probably arrange not to be taxed in Hong Kong, and you could certainly arrange not to be taxed in Portugal by going through the NHR status, so you can eradicate both taxes. And the same sort of thing applies. There are many people living in Portugal who are actually tax resident in the UK and Portugal. And then you have to rely on the tax treaty, which gives the taxing right to the place of closest connection. And the place of closest connection is defined as where you have a business, where you have a home, where you have family, where you have your social and economic ties. And sometimes all those things are equal, because we have many clients who have homes in both places and social circles and businesses in both places, or businesses in neither. So you can reach the stage where you've got a draw. Then we believe, and this is untested, that it would come down to the number of days spent in each place, and the taxing right would be given to Portugal if you spend more days in Portugal, and the UK if you spend more days in the UK. But the treaty says it's up for the taxing authorities to agree it amongst themselves who gets the taxing right, but somebody gets the sole rights who don't pay tax in both. So that's because of the tax treaty. So as ever with these things, seemingly simple matters require quite complicated planning to get it right, or at least without any planning at all, you can get it very wrong. And you can end up with not just tax in Portugal, but tax in lots of different places. So you've got to bear that in mind. There is no such thing as exclusively resident anywhere, or at least it's difficult to arrive at that stage, but you can arrange your affairs so that you are taxable in one place and possibly not taxable at all, but it takes care and it takes planning. I have another question here. As a UK national, is it possible to apply for a golden visa this year? Yes, it is, but you don't need to, because you can just apply for residency without needing the golden visa. The question goes on. We have invested in property in Lisbon and therefore would not be eligible if we waited until the golden visa rules change in 2021. Okay, now, if you've already bought property in Portugal and it's of $500,000 or above, then in theory you could apply for golden visa on the basis of the already made investment. I don't think you need to make a new one. I can't be certain that that's the correct answer there, because there will come a time when that investment is too old or too late. But if it was made when the golden visa existed, I think you could use it. If it was made before the golden visa scheme existed, then you certainly can't. And I'm not certain that if it was made some time ago that it would form the basis of a golden visa application. I don't know the answer to that, but I can check. But I probably don't need to, because you don't need a golden visa. You can just apply for resident status as NHR and you're done. And that would give you the right to live there in your own property. You already have a property, so that would be your address. So my recommendation would be, unless you particularly want to invest in Portuguese property to a greater extent for investment reasons alone, that you don't need to think about the golden visa. You're a UK national, just obtain residency, but get your application in for NHR status as quickly as possible, and certainly before the end of the year, after which you're going to pay 10% tax if you go and live there. Another question here. Does NHR alone bestow any travel privileges to other Schengen countries? Yes, it does. You would be a Portuguese resident for all immigration purposes. So you would get Schengen visa privileges and have the right to travel in and out of all European countries pretty well without restriction. And of course, that right is in theory going to be lost to UK nationals at the end of the year, when we are out of the EU for all practical purposes. We've left legally, but we have this transition period until the end of the year. So come 1st of January next year, of course, we have to wait to see what sort of deal Boris will do with the EU should he be returning to work. and able to negotiate anything, and see whether they are going to extend travel privileges to British nationals. I would suggest it's unlikely, but it's possible that we do a deal which basically maintains all the privileges we had before if we give up fishing rights or whatever they want in return. But right now, your ability to travel without visa to other European countries ends on the 1st of January. Another question here, how long do you need to rent before you can apply for residency? Does it matter where in Portugal you rent? The answer is, as soon as you've obtained the right to live in Portugal through a rental contract, so day one, you can apply for NHR status on day one. So the process is, you need a contract in the required format from your property owner, which would be recognized by the local town hall, local to where your property is, and you would then go along to that town hall and register yourself as resident and note that you wish to be NHR. So you can do it all on one day in theory, but there are certain other steps which I briefly alluded to which go along with that, such as opening a bank account, getting a tax registration number, and several other formalities. Unhelpfully, the exact requirements depend on exactly where you are applying. They are much stricter in Lisbon than they are in Estremoz, which is where I make my wine on the Spanish border. All of them require you to turn up personally with your existing passport. So you can do most things in Portugal by issuing a power of attorney to a representative in Portugal, which saves you being there. This you cannot do. You must be there personally with your passport and get yourself registered. So allow 3 or 4 days to complete all these formalities, and then you're done. Let's see, what else have we got? What sort of tax would you pay after the 10 years of NHR? After 10 years, unless things change, you revert to being an ordinary Portuguese tax resident, taxable on your worldwide income at normal Portuguese rates, which are broadly equivalent to UK rates. So personal income tax rates go up to around 50%, same as the UK, and you can expect those to be applied across your worldwide income wherever or howsoever it arises. Again, there will be ways of planning that and minimizing it, but you are going to end up paying some tax for sure. But it is possible to structure things so that irrespective of where you live and irrespective of the tax system, a minimal amount of your income is subject to that tax system. And here we are thinking particularly of, at the moment, trusts seem to work very well to allow you to roll up income offshore and keep it outside Portuguese tax, although in common with most developed countries, they are developing more and more sophisticated rules which seek to tax trust income as though it belonged to the settlor or the beneficiaries, but right now those still work. Pension planning will always work. All high tax nations grant tax incentives to people who insure their lives, set up pensions, or give to charities. And the rationale behind this is relatively clear. All these things are a cost on the government if they're not done privately. So if the head of household doesn't insure his life and is the first to die, his family become a burden on the state because they have no alternative source of living. So generally speaking, life insurance is given a tax break and treated very advantageously for tax purposes. Pensions the same. All developed nations are keen that their residents should save for their retirement because otherwise they will be a burden on the state. So pensions are treated very favorably. And charitable giving is obviously given a tax break to encourage it because charities do a lot of work which otherwise governments would have to do. So utilizing those 3 methods, you can often minimize tax considerably, and sometimes more traditional structures such as offshore companies or offshore trusts can work For Portugal, they look through offshore companies and tax the shareholders as though they received all the underlying income, even if they don't. So there is a, if you like, they're taxed like partnerships. So those used to work no longer do. An offshore company owned by a trust currently would work, and that would allow the underlying income to roll up tax-free until you actually paid it out. So those things can still be useful for planning for if you are a Portuguese tax resident. In 10 years' time, I mean, in theory, we may find that they roll the deal over because fearing that a lot of these wealthy residents they've attracted to Portugal will leave if they do not. The other theory is that that's when payback comes, and that's when they see the big advantage of having attracted these people in the first place, and they've made the deal perfectly clear that it only lasts for 10 years. So there will be pressures to extend it. Who knows? There is no precedent to suggest whether they will extend it or you just revert to being an ordinary tax resident, taxable on worldwide income. I personally think it'll be the latter, as they will look at it as we've done what we wanted to do, which is boost the economy by attracting these people and getting them spending money, paying VAT, buying in the shops, employing people, visiting the restaurants and all this. And we've given them a good enough deal now. And after 10 years, they're unlikely to want to leave if they have to pay a bit of tax. So I think they will tax you fully in accordance with the existing rules or the rules at the time. How many days per year can you spend in Portugal and not attract Portuguese tax? Okay, there's no straightforward answer to that. I did refer to this earlier, but by way of reminder, for sure, if you spend more than half a year in Portugal, you are a Portuguese tax resident and taxable on your worldwide income, unless you have NHR status, in which case currently 0, in the future 10%. However, if Portugal is your main home or primary residence, then you would also be taxable irrespective of the number of days you spent there. So generally speaking, how they're applying this rule is if you have property there, either rented or in your own name, and you have to become a Portuguese resident at all, you have to have a place to live. You can't really be a resident there if you can't live there. Then you certainly have a home. Unless you can point to somewhere else where you are resident instead, even though it could be as well, then they will consider you as Portuguese tax resident. So this is unlikely to happen unless you spend 3 or 4 months there. But if you do spend 3 or 4 months there in your property and you cannot point to where else you are tax resident, then they will certainly seek to tax you. If you can point to where else you are resident, then we get into this situation I was illustrating earlier, where there would have to be a decision made if there is a tax treaty between the two places as to which country gets the taxing right. If there is no tax treaty, then it could simply be the case that you are tax resident in both places, and then practice, but there is no legal requirement to do that, is that one place gives a credit for tax paid on the same income in the other. So again, if you took the example of an ordinary Portuguese tax resident who didn't have NHR status, who, let's say for the purpose of this illustration, is subject to tax at 50% on the worldwide income, they're also tax resident in Hong Kong and they've earned some money and paid 16%, 15% tax on it. So Portugal would likely go, okay, you've paid 15, we want 50, we'll let you pay 35 here. So it works on a tax credit system rather than a taxing right exemption system. So there's different systems depending on which 2 countries you are talking about. But as I say, you can actually be tax resident in more than 2 countries. You can be tax resident in many, at least 4. It's quite difficult to spend enough time in any one country to do more than 4, but you can certainly be tax resident in 4. Another question here. Given all costs, benefits, is there merit in applying for NHR to have in the short term for Schengen travel benefits and to have option for residency at a later date? Yes. you cannot have NHR without being resident. So those two things are think of them as two separate applications. One is to apply to be resident, and the second application is to apply to enjoy NHR status. So you can't have one without the other, or you can't have NHR without being resident. You can be resident without applying for NHR. But then again, you need to understand the difference between legally residents and tax residents. The two are not the same. So you could apply for residency there under any status you like, and then because you don't live there and because you have another tax residency or another main home, then you would not be Portuguese tax resident. You would just have the legal liability, the legal ability to be resident. So you have legal residency, not tax residency. If you apply for resident status and actually live there or do enough to be tax resident as well, then you're taxable on your worldwide income unless you've also applied for NHR status. So have been given this 10-year special exemption. So it can be confusing, the interaction between these two different statuses, and they can be both part of the same application, but that is a clear distinction between legal residence and your legal ability to live there, and tax resident, which is your liability to tax under whatever system you've come in under. So what we're saying to people is, given the fact that the NHR status is changing and becoming a 10% tax, get your application in now so that you can apply under the 0% tax, and that should continue for your 10-year period. Even if they then change the rules, they should only apply to residents who apply for NHR status after the operative date. So we think that certainly by the end of the year, that status will have changed, and people who apply for NHR will pay 10% tax, and it may change sooner than that. The time is now, ladies and gentlemen, the time is now. What you can do now is fairly certain. What you can do at the end of the year is not. So again, if you're a UK passport holder, get your residency application in before the end of the year. Otherwise, you will have to go through an investment process, the golden visa, for example, to get resident status. Get your resident status application in as soon as possible, because fairly soon we know that the tax regime is going to change to one of 10% from 0%. So I think, to be safe, you need to get down there before the end of October to ensure that that application goes through under the current zero tax deal and under the current no requirement for immigrant status, because we're still EU. That's if you're a UK passport holder. If you're not an EU passport holder, then you need to apply under the golden visa. And again, do it before the end of the year if you wish to invest in Lisbon property, which is the easiest, simplest way of getting it and the best investment, I would suggest. So you have until the end of the year before you can no longer apply by investing in property in Lisbon or Porto or any coastal area, is how it looks like it's going to be termed. I've got another question here. If I want to set up a business, is there any minimum requirement for that business setup, please? Yes, there is. You can apply for resident status on the basis of starting a business there. There are lots of different options under this category. Generally speaking, you need to invest €1 million and employ 10 people, but you could also invest through a fund. I'd say that probably isn't a business, it's not a privately owned business, but there are lots of different options under that category. All of them are much more complicated than the property investment, but if you were looking to start a business anyway and invest sufficient, then that would be your option, because you don't need the property, you just need the business to apply for the golden visa status, if that is your motivation. But if your motivation is purely to get the right to live there in case you want to go there, then the simplest way is to go through the property investment, the golden visa. So what we're finding as a company is that a lot of the golden visa applicants are coming from across the border, from South Africa and increasingly from Russia. So I can keep this as unpolitical as possible, given the sensitivities of the local area. Let's examine the South African option. Most of those people do not want to go and live in Portugal. They just want the right to be able to go there in case things turn nasty in their own country. And I suppose they look across the border in Zimbabwe and see that this is perfectly possible. So they're taking out an insurance policy which gives them the right to live somewhere if they want to. So they apply through the golden visa, as that's the quickest and easiest way of getting it, and then never go near the place again. But they do know that at any given moment, they could go and live in Portugal if they wanted to. So that's one category, and those, in our experiences, are the majority of the people who are applying through the golden visa. For those who actually want to go and live there, then they need NHR status. Otherwise, you pay full tax, having taken out residency and gone to live there. So that is obtainable as of right by EU residents now without the golden visa application, but only until the end of the year. After that, Brits who currently hold an EU passport will no longer hold an EU passport. They'll hold a British passport, which gives you no automatic right of abode in Portugal. So you will need to go through the normal immigration channels if you wish to go and live there. So you need to narrow down your motivation. If all you want is a backstop where you have somewhere to live, if you need to get out of Dodge quick, then you go through the immigration channels applicable to your passport. But I would say still take out the NHR status, because that fixes it at 10 years tax-free. So, for example, we've had a number of different South African clients who've gone through the golden visa. They've had no interest in the NHR status because they never have any intention of living there. So there's no tax for them anyway, because they're legally resident but not tax resident. However, we're saying to them, look, why don't you just get your NHR application in? Because if by any chance the worst comes to the worst, which means you do have to flee South Africa and you do go to Portugal, if you don't get your NHR now, it may no longer be around at all. If it is around, it'll certainly be at a 10% tax rather than a zero tax. So why don't you just take out the insurance policy now and apply for NHR status, even though you have no intention of living there currently? Because the two go hand in hand. Your golden visa is to give you the right to live there and is your insurance policy. Why not bolt on to that your tax insurance policy? So that's how we're looking at it. So another question. Under the revised NHR rules, 10% tax will be applied in Portugal. If I already pay 15% tax on earnings in Hong Kong, will that be set off against Portuguese tax liability, or I will have to pay 10% in addition? No, it would be a set off. That would be a worst case scenario. Clever people like those who work at Sovereign will probably be able to get rid of your Hong Kong bill and your Portuguese bill, leaving you with a zero bill anyway. But if you applied for NHR status now, you would not be taxable in Portugal anyway, because it's zero. If you wait until next year and apply, yes, probably it's 10% tax, but yes, you would get a set off of the 15, so there wouldn't be any tax anyway. So that would work. Another question here. It's from Kerry. Hello, Kerry. You know the answer to this. Regarding golden visa questions above, redeveloped 30 years or more is still available, and we have partners who specialize in that. Sorry, it's not a question, it's a statement. That's good information. Yeah, there are certain properties where you can refurbish a property and then your entry level for investment purposes lower, and these options still exist. Yes, I see that question's been asked by somebody else. Is that still available? Yes, it is. And we have properties on our books which fit into that category. So if that's of interest, talk to us and we can send you some details. Another question, would I need to maintain the rental throughout the 10 years? Well, in theory, yes, but in practice, there seems to be no checking and no actual legal requirement that once you've applied through an address, you still have to have an address. we can't find anything which says that if your rental contract doesn't last for 10 years, that your status is in danger of lapsing. However, logically, that would be the case, because whatever the legislation says, the spirit is, and I think it pays if you are relying on this long term to act within the spirit of the law as well as the law itself. You can't really be resident in Portugal legally or for tax purposes if you don't have an address there. So if you're not living there and you can't live there, you can't be there. So it's logical that the status would be, if not lapsing, and we don't think it lapses, but it's subject to challenge. And in particular, if you lost your address and then went there later and claimed no tax due to NHR, which is how you do it, then there would be a risk that they said, well, your status lapsed, so you'd have to make a new application. And actually you can't apply for NHR status if you have been legally resident in Portugal at any time during the previous 5 years. So that is a requirement that you are a new resident. So if you play around with the rules and try and play a bit fast and loose for the sake of a few bucks, maintaining a room in somebody's house or whatever it is, then you're putting yourself certainly at some risk. My best guess is that, knowing the Portuguese as I do, that you would probably get away with that, but why risk it for the sake of a few bucks? So I believe the correct answer is legally there's no problem. Practically there may well be, and I suggest you don't bend the rules. Can you move forward on golden visa without being physically present in Portugal at all? No, you must be in Portugal to actually make the physical application. So you could do all the things which lead up to that. You could identify the property, exchange contracts on it, do everything else regarding your investments. But to actually get the status, you must be present in Portugal at the time and go through these steps, which are the same for the NHR becoming resident as they are for the golden visa, because all it is a residency application at the end of the day, turning up at the town hall with your passport, registering yourself, and doing all the other bells and whistles. I don't see that changing particularly. So we are not really seeing any changes to the golden visa regime in the practical application of it. The big change, as I mentioned, is that property investments in Lisbon, Portugal, and probably the Algarve will no longer qualify for these purposes. So depending on what you are thinking of doing, for most people, they need to get it in before the end of the year, because for most people, the Lisbon property investment is the one to have. We still believe it's a very good investment with prices rapidly increasing. It is still a cheap place to buy property. For the size of a shoebox, which you literally couldn't swing a cat in Hong Kong, you can get yourself a nice penthouse apartment in the right center of Lisbon. So prices have gone up. Well, I'm going to take a broad guess. Over the last 3 years, they've probably gone up by about 50% for the good stuff. So a rapid increase. But they're still cheap in world terms. And there doesn't look to be any reason why that growth in price would slow down. It is a very attractive place to live. And a lot of people are moving there because it's a nice place and because of the 10-year deal. They're not necessarily golden visa applicants, and they may well be buying property which is way in excess of the minimum required for golden visa. So that's a different market, but there is a roll call of celebs and wealthy people who are now moving down to Portugal. I think, like every other country, as progress brings price increases, but it also makes it easier to live there, and that's certainly true of Portugal. The medical services have improved out of sight. The bar and restaurant scene is phenomenal, where once it was almost impossible to get a decent meal or have a good night out. Now it's just fantastic. And the climate, fun enough, has stayed pretty much the same. So all these things add up to a very appealing package, and it is now being worldwide recognized as such. And they are attracting hundreds, if not thousands, of new residents a year. again, there's different motivations. A lot of Swedish people are moving down, and they tend to go to the Algarve. Retirement people, they're on the tax year deal, 10-year tax year deal. They don't need to buy houses. They get that because they can just rent a place and go and live there, but they are physically moving down. So Germans and Swedes are doing it for tax motivations. Chinese, Russians, South Africans are going through the golden visa because they don't have any right of abode there, and they want a right of abode in case things cut up rough at home. So different motivations for different people, but in all cases, get it done now. Another question. If already holding British and Portuguese passports and residency in Portugal but not living there full time currently, is NH application still worth achieving? Thinking, right, you've got a difficulty there in that the NHR status is only available to new residents. So people who have not had resident status there 5 years previously. So I think this might rule it out. However, if you've only recently become Portuguese resident, it may be worth us checking to see whether you can still apply for NHR status. The answer is I'm not entirely clear on that, but the general rule is anybody who's been resident in the last 5 years cannot apply for this new resident status, NHR status. Another question here. Thank you, got to dash. Okay, nice to see you. Thank you very much. Do you think property prices in Lisbon will be affected after the GB changes? Yes, I do. I think you're going to see a slowdown for sure in the growth of prices in this minimum price bracket of €500,000. So without real expert knowledge of the market there, I think that we were seeing a lot of properties which were worth 350, sold at 500. That will stop. We were seeing rapid growth in the 500 to 750 price band because of the pressure on. There's a shortage of supply, really. It's actually not easy to find a decent place. And they've been very good about it in Lisbon because really they've been forcing the developers to repurpose old stock. So they've been refurbishing old buildings. There's not that much new build. So there is pressure on supply, and that's had a fairly dramatic effect on prices within those price brackets. Above that, much less so. Because if you are, and I would imagine a lot of people in Hong Kong, if they're moving there, if they're selling a house in Hong Kong, you can buy a palace in Lisbon. So that's a totally different price category. So I think it's in this 350 to 700 price category where we're going to see a slowdown in the growth. I don't think we're necessarily going to see falls, but less rapid increases. So I would suggest it's probably still worthwhile as a basis for the golden visa. But if you're looking for a pure investment, you might want to go higher because I think that's where the growth will come, or hold off. So again, it depends on your motivation, whether it's the visa you want or the investment, and there is an element of both there. We are now at 1:28, and I was given strict instructions to sign off at 1:30, so I have done my time. And I thank you all for listening and dialing in. It's kind of strange doing this remotely, isn't it? But I guess we get used to it. But if you need more information, you know where we are, or you can contact us through the chamber. I've got some notes and articles I've written on this subject, which I can send out. And I think the chamber are happy to distribute those for me. And Martine will come on in a minute and perhaps confirm that one way or the other. But for the moment, it's good night from him, and it's good night from me. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Howard. We're really grateful to have you here. And thank you so much to all of our audience for watching. The British Chamber is also hosting lots of other webinars, so please do check out our website if you'd like to sign up for more. We're also hosting another webinar tomorrow from 12:30 to 1:30. The link, I believe, should be a chat box now. It's going to be on inheritance tax, so please do sign up if you're interested. And yes, so just thank you again to Howard. And like he says, if you would like to get in touch with Howard, please do reach out to us directly, and we can connect you to the Sovereign Group. So I think that's it from us. So thank you again to Howard and to everybody else, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.